Fox Tales International presents A Storyteller's Tour of Bishop Hill. Written, hosted, and produced by Brian Fox Ellis. Filmed by Anthony Pegg of Twin City Productions and Frank Angelsek of Refractive Films. Welcome to A Storyteller's Tour of Bishop Hill. My name is Brian Fox Ellis, and please come along as we explore this utopia on the prairie. The story begins in Sweden in the earliest part of the 1800s when there was a religious revival. The movement were called the Readers or Devotionalists, and they were actually illegal because it was against the law to read the Bible to yourself and think for yourself. That can always be dangerous. You have to understand that the church and the state were very much in bed together. They told you when to pray, what to pray, how to pray, and you could be fined or imprisoned if not paying your tithing or your taxes. Well, into this movement there came a young man by the name of Janson. He was a very charismatic speaker, and he became their leader. We'll hear his story next. So Janson was a wheat flour salesman, which was his excuse to travel around Sweden and to meet with the devotionalist movement. And he was a very charismatic speaker. The crowds would gather. It went from a few people hiding in somebody's parlor reading the Bible to being large groups of hundreds. And when they began burning books, the church could no longer ignore them. And Eric was arrested. And there are actually several scenes here that I think would make a great scene in a made-for-TV movie. At one point, he was in a carriage being taken to jail, and some of the elders stopped the carriage. And they created a distraction while others snuck up behind and stole him out of the stagecoach. Eventually, Olof Olson, one of the founders of the movement, he met with the king of Sweden. And the king of Sweden agreed to allow Eric to leave as long as he left the country. And the followers were faced with a very difficult choice. Put yourself in their shoes. Would you follow this charismatic leader into the unknown? Or would you go back to the Lutheran church that you had already disavowed? Here's a $1 million question. What would it take for me to convince you to sell everything you own and give me all your money and then follow me to the wilderness? They made this difficult choice. Families were separated. One family I know, I met their descendant. The teenagers ran away in the woods and refused to go. And the parents left them. Husbands left wives, wives left husbands. Those that could afford it not only paid for their passage, but Olof Olson paid for his entire family and his hired hands to come along. And they left. And they came here. And I'll show you in just a moment why they chose this place in the wilderness of Illinois. So once they decided to come to America, Olof Olson sent his younger brother Olof Olson ahead to scout. When Olof arrived in New York City, he met a Swedish Methodist minister named Reverend Hellstrom, who said, "I have a brother in Illinois, you should go visit there." The other Reverend Hellstrom, who founded the first Swedish Methodist church in Illinois, said, "Just north of here is a sweet piece of prairie. There's timber and a river." And they came here. Because of the Edwards River, it meant there would be year-round water. Because of the red oak grove, there'd be good building material in the midst of the prairie. He then traveled to 5 other states around the Midwest and came back and said, "Yeah, this is the best place." At first, they bought just a little more than 20 acres, but eventually they bought more than 10,000 acres to found this utopia on the prairie. We sold our våra hemmen, we sold our home in Sweden and sailed away from friends. Like the bird that wings on southward when summer slowly ends, they return in the springtime to nest upon the strand. But we will never once again see our dear motherland. No, we will never once again see our dear motherland. Vi sold our våra hemmen, vi sold our våra hemmen, we sold our homes in Sweden. And so they left everything behind. They sailed across the Atlantic and arrived in New York City. They were told that when their foot touches the ground in America, they would speak English. And when that didn't happen, they didn't doubt Eric, they doubted their own faith. They went up the Hudson River to Albany, New York. They traveled through the Erie Canal to Lake Erie. They sailed across Lake Erie and through the Great Lakes to Chicago. And then they walked from Chicago to here. Too late in the year to get in a crop. And there was no market economy. There was nobody to sell them food. And what they had brought ran out. That first winter was long and cold and hard. They actually dug into these gullies, little man-made caves called dugouts, and nearly 100 of them died. Now, one ship left later, and by the time they arrived, the Great Lakes were beginning to freeze, and so in December, they walked from Toledo, Ohio to here. Now, first, Eric Janson began to pray and to preach fasting. Yes, let's make the food go a little further. And then he began to pray and to preach celibacy. Now, some people didn't sign on for that, and so they left. They went to Chicago. But we can't afford to feed ourselves, let alone bring children into this world. Knowing that 1 out of 5 ships on average sank, of course, the 6 ships they sailed on, 1 of them went down. And that first winter was unimaginably cold and dark and dank, but they survived. And when spring came, they got in a good crop, and they built everything that you will see on this tour. This entire town, this utopia on the prairie, was built by those immigrants. Vi solda våra hemmen, vi solda våra hemmen. We sold our homes in Sweden and sailed away from friends, like the bird that wings on southward when summer slowly ends. So where I'm standing now in this ball field used to be one of the largest brick buildings west of Chicago. After that first winter, they went on a building spree. They learned how to dig clay and make their own bricks, and made more than 1 million of them. Big Brick, which would have gone from me to home base all across this ball field, was the largest brick building west of Chicago. Nearly 100 apartments. And on the ground floor was the dining room, where they served 3 breakfasts, 3 lunch, and 3 dinner. So across the gully was the bakery/brewery, where they would brew a low alcohol beer, even children drank it, safer than the water. And then they would take the spent grain and dry it, toast it, grind it, and make a Swedish cracker. On the other side of the gully was also the butcher shop. And they would butcher the animals and then store them in the ground floor, stored in salt and cool underground. But there's so much salt in that butcher block floor that even today, if you have furniture with metal feet, it will rust. So this was the heart of the community, where they lived and fed each other. Big Brick, the brewery/bakery, and the meat packing and meat storage. Let's head over to the church. So this is actually the 3rd church. The first one was more of a tent-like structure. The second one was a very large log cabin. Because of the length of the logs, they built it in a cross shape, but pretty quickly began working on this church, which is the heart and soul of the community. You can see on the ground floor and first floor there were apartments, some of the first apartments for the community, and then the sanctuary is upstairs. Let's head on up. Har gute Gottet vara, o vad livet dakar hund, he vad fred från fåglaskara, se hur gräset lyser grönt. So the church is the heart and soul of the community. The first thing I noticed are the 2 sets of stairs. Men came up one side and women came up the other. And if we had time to go into the church, you'll notice a divider down the middle, that men sat on one side and women sat on the other. The acoustics are beautiful, and I love to sing. And Eric wrote hundreds of hymns. And on Sunday, church service would last 3 or 4 hours. It is also one of my favorite museums in town. During the walking tour, we don't have time, but I would highly encourage you on your own to come inside. They have an apartment set up with original furniture made by the Swedes, including things that look like something from an IKEA catalog today. And then they have another apartment set up you can enter and touch with really beautiful modern recreations of the historical furniture. There's an exhibit on the immigrant experience and they're coming to America. It's really one of the best museums in town. And if we had time, I'd love to go in. But we don't have time, so let's go on and see the rest of the community. So this is the Bishop Hill Creative Commons, or just the Commons. It was originally the blacksmith shop, and for 35 years it was a quilt shop known as the Village Smithy. And recently it became the Commons. It is an artist cooperative. We have a dozen artists in here who make everything from quilts to jewelry, some fine art paintings, some traditional folk arts, felt work and beadwork, and also there's an author who sells his books here. We also have a concert series with literally some of the best bands touring the world, stopping here in Bishop Hill, including Jerv, who provides a soundtrack. We recorded them here, and we have Irish bands and Scottish bands, the best of bluegrass, the best from Nashville and Austin, LA and New York. The Commons is a place that celebrates the artists within all of us, whether it's performing arts and music or handcrafts and fine arts. This is the Colony Dairy Building. It's one of the latter buildings built in 1855 with some of that beautiful Bishop Hill brick. The upstairs was housing for the dairy maids, the single young women who worked here, turning dairy products, the milk, the raw milk, into butter and cheese. And then down below, they would store that butter, it was cooler underground, and age the cheese to feed the community. After the community dissolved, the building was turned into several apartments and recently restored by the Bishop Hill Heritage Association. There is still one apartment for rent. Upstairs would make a great artist studio, and on the ground floor they use for public events. They have some great concerts and historical lecture series, and you could even rent it for your next event. This is the Albert Kranz livery stable, built in 1908, so after the colony had dissolved, but it has a very direct tie to the colony. Albert was the nephew of Olof Kranz, the great painter. Now the main stable would have been just south of here and large enough to house 200 horses. So the smaller building housed the carriages and the saddles and the leather goods. It's open to the public and you can see the period goods that they used for their horses in those days. We are really lucky here in Bishop Hill that in a town of barely 100 people, we've got 5 great restaurants. The newest one is Kranz Cafe, which is more of a coffee shop, but they serve panini and sandwiches. One of my favorite is the Filling Station. They're kind of mom and pop comfort food and really great pie, daily specials, open for lunch every stinking day. And then we've got PL Janson's, which is more traditional Swedish food. Swedish meatballs and salads, fresh baked breads, and did I mention the pie? Their pie is so good. The Colony Inn is the bar, but they have great pizzas, and Taco Thursday is something I look forward to every week, and the best wings in town. And then we have the bakery. And of course the bakery has great baked goods, soups and sandwiches for lunch. And did I mention the pie? Maybe you haven't noticed, but I've been doing research for 8 years on who has the best pie, and I still can't make up my mind. Maybe you need to come to Bishop Hill and do your own research and try the pie at all the places. So this next building is known today as the Prairie Arts Center. We have a broom maker, we have a weaver, we have rug hookers, and lots of traditional crafts going on. It was built originally as a blacksmith shop on the first floor, because you don't want to fire upstairs. And the second floor is Wagon Hall, where they put the wagons together. You might think that's odd, but if you go out back, there's this really unusual staircase where it's wide and it's an odd angle, so you can roll the wagons down when they're done. Off to my right, we have the carpenter shop. Now this is the place where they made the wooden boxes for the wagons, the wooden spokes, and all the wooden components that were taken across the street to Wagenhall, where the blacksmith would bring up the metal parts and they put it all together. Today it is our post office, and there's a beautiful little shop called Garden Time that celebrates our relationship to the earth. So the Steeple building is one of my favorite museums in town. If you go in the back right corner, there's a beautiful exhibit on the immigrants' experience. There's also a changing exhibit on a regular basis, something new to discover. Upstairs are a lot of colony-era artifacts donated by the descendants and their families. This building has served so many purposes over time. For a short while, it was a school. When the telephone came to town, the telephone operator was here. And it was apartments for a while. So when the Bishop Hill Heritage Association purchased the building, they actually had to buy it from several different families, like condos. They owned different rooms. If you pause for a moment, it's pretty easy to imagine the King of Sweden standing on that sunlit portico, because he was here. Actually, every time the Bishop Hill Heritage Association does a major renovation of one of the historic buildings, Sweden as a nation has been very supportive, and the king came when this building was reopened. Over my shoulder here, you see the Civil War monument. When the Civil War began, Bishop Hill boys enlisted in droves. They came to this country for the freedoms that we were founded on. Freedom of thought, freedom of the press, and in particular, freedom of religion. And so when they knew they could fight to give freedom to millions of enslaved souls, they fought in every major battle in the Western Theater, from Shiloh to Corinth all the way to Vicksburg. They marched to Atlanta and to Savannah in the sea. An entire company from Bishop Hill fought throughout the Civil War. So the Colony Store was the economic engine of the town. It was built by people outside the community so that folks could come and shop the merchandise that the community made. They made miles of linen, hundreds of hooked rugs, and thousands of brooms. So this was more like a showcase where buyers would come in, and we have the account books. They'd say, oh, I'll take 1,000 brooms for Chicago, or I'll take 2,000 brooms for New York or Philadelphia. And today it is the candy store. They have lots of great gifts from Sweden. But one of my favorite stories you probably won't read in a history book. There was a gentleman who delivered groceries here during the Depression, during Prohibition, and in every box of bananas, there would be a bottle of rum. I actually heard that story from the grandson of the man who delivered the rum. He saw it with his own 2 eyes. And then we also have Vasa, which is the International Swedish Immigration Center. Again, the King of Sweden helped to fund that building. And if you're of Swedish descent, it's a good place to do some genealogical research. This is the Bishop Hill State Museum. And even though it's one of the newer buildings built in the 1970s, the architect and design built something that really blends in, using the same kind of brick that many of the other structures are made with. This building also is a treasure trove of Bishop Hill history. It has a wonderful little introductory video. It has the Olof Kranz collection. Olof Kranz, some people say, is the Grandma Moses of Bishop Hill. He's self-taught as a house painter. For the 50th anniversary, he painted all of his childhood memories of the towns, giving us a visual record. Most utopias were built before there were cameras, and so they do not have the visual record that we have, thanks to the Olof Kranz paintings. For the 50th anniversary celebration, he also painted a portrait of all the surviving members. So if these people came here when they were 20 or 30 or 40, for the 50th anniversary, they're now 70 or 80 or 90, which explains the age on the faces that you will see. It is well worth a visit, and I highly recommend maybe you start your tour here at the Bishop Hill State Museum. So here on opposite sides of the street, we have two houses that look very much like mirrored opposites. These houses were built just after the colony dissolved by two trustees who helped to run the colony in its final years, Swanson and Jacob Jacobson. And I won't say it's a keeping up with the Jones kind of thing, but similar architecture, mirrored images. They're really beautiful examples of the style of architecture that was popular in the late 1860s. And the family lived in these houses until very recently. Descendants of the original colonists owned both of these homes. So the Bishop Hill Heritage Association and the old settlers have worked together to preserve a lot of the old buildings, and then they become storefronts and shops to celebrate the crafts and the traditions of Bishop Hill. So the Colony Store is one of the premier stores, but we also have quilt shops and broom makers, we have pottery, we have artists who do painting and jewelry. You should come to Bishop Hill and see many of these shops. So these two buildings look very much the same because they serve basically the same purpose. They are the administrative buildings. This is where the business was done in the community. And we do have the old account books so we can look back through and see the kind of business that happened here, selling thousands of brooms and rugs to regional businessmen. Both buildings also had apartments where some of the administrators lived, and this one here on the left had a bathhouse where you would bring a stack of dirty laundry and they would hand you clean clothes because all the clothing was owned in common. It was also the place where you'd get your shower once a week or your bath in the bathhouse. Today this is the Gallery Inn, and the one here on the left is one of our newer shops, the Red Geranium, an antique store. So the Colony Hotel was again built for outsiders, businessmen, who came to the colony to purchase those buggies or brooms. One of my favorite features is on the third floor. There's a beautiful ballroom, wide open. Also, of course, that beautiful steeple up there. The first floor is a museum with some colony-era furniture, so you get a sense of what the hotel was like in the day. So, the Colony School and the hospital were two of the last buildings built by the community before they dissolved, after the death of Eric Janson. Eric Janson preached that if your faith was strong enough, the moment your foot touched soil in America, you'd speak English. When that didn't happen, he married an English teacher. He also preached that if your faith was strong enough, you would not get sick. So after he dies, they build a hospital. My favorite story about the school is that Carl Sandburg's sister was one of the early teachers here. And when Carl was a young man, he would take the train from Galesburg, and he would come here to visit his sister's class and recite poetry for the students here in Bishop Hill. Welcome to the Twin Flower Inn. This is actually where I live. And it was originally built as a colony hospital. And it was one of the last buildings built by the community before they dissolved. And this was a hospital that served the surrounding community as well as this utopia on the prairie. It was a hospital during the Civil War, and we know that Civil War soldiers came back here to recuperate. On the third floor are the nurses' quarters. On the first floor are some rooms to rent. Today it's a bed and breakfast. But my favorite room, you have to ask nicely, I'll show you the apothecary. It is a brick floor, brick wall, and barrel vault brick ceiling where they would store the herbs and medicines, apothecary. Today, it is a bed and breakfast. We have 5 rooms to rent, and we serve meals that are mostly locally grown things. Please come and stop at the Twin Flower Inn. So let us end the story where we began, at the home of Eric Janson. Some say the community dissolved because so many soldiers went off to Civil War. Some say it was the economic downturn in the federal economy. Some say it was the murder of Eric Janson. Another great scene for a made-for-TV movie. John Root murders Eric Janson in the courtroom in front of the sheriff and the judge. He actually takes the pistol from the sheriff and shoots him point blank in the heart, and he falls dead. Some community members believe that he was not just a prophet, but the prophet. And they sat by his grave for 3 days, expecting him to rise again. When that didn't happen, a council was formed, like an oligarchy, to run this theocracy, this religious community. Now, very few communities survived their first winter, and fewer still survived cholera, and almost none of them survived the murder of their charismatic leader. But they had their best years. They built the school and the hospital, and they continued to grow. But there was an economic downturn, and a lot of the young men went off to war. And so when the community was dissolved, everything was divided, not exactly evenly, but fairly. Every shirt was counted, every silver spoon, and given. Women to children even received property. Now, of course, if you were one of the founders who made a large investment, you got 1,000 acres. And if you were a nurse in the hospital, you got one room, the nurses' quarters, and 5 acres of woods, so you had a woodlot to provide fuel for the winter. Eventually, the community dissolved, but it is still a utopia on the prairie. And I'd like to end with a quote from Olof Olson for the 50th anniversary of the founding of the old settlers. It would be a great comfort if we in our old age could be spared witnessing the destruction that has recently threatened us. And if our descendants, after we have gone to our fathers, have nobler things to view when looking back on bygone days than a ruined place intended as a dwelling for the people of God.